And welcome back, guys. So please join me. Open up your Canvas page. Look under Files, Lecture Notes. And I don't see it there. So I may add it later. Let me go up one level. Perhaps it's somewhere else. Okay, so it's actually in a different spot, and it's under the Only for Teachers file, so I'll see what I can do, but it's actually excerpts from your textbook, and so I guess you already had access to it. So I'd like to start breaking down examples of assumptions, and then I'm going to read some passages from your textbooks, and we're going to practice together pulling assumptions out. Okay? So setting my timer so I don't waste your time. Okay. So as we mentioned in the first video in this series, an assumption is a preconscious habitual way of thinking, feeling, and reacting. A belief is the story we tell ourselves. Assumptions and beliefs are related. Sometimes they're related in a way where one's a little different, sometimes even diametrically opposite the other, and sometimes they're related when there's subtle variations between the two, that in general, my assumptions and beliefs align, in general, sometimes they don't, and here's how. So it's puzzling for students, or can be puzzling for students, when they go, okay, Matt, why are we talking about this when, I've been a psychology major and no one else talks about this. In fact, I've had students go on to get PhDs and not a single one of them said, hey Matt, I went and got my doctorate degree and it was deeply introspective and deeply self-analytic. Well, the reason why we don't talk about assumptions and beliefs anymore is because psychology wants desperately to be a science. Now, some of you are saying, well, Matt, psychology is a science. No, we would have to so broaden the definition of science for psychology to be a science that the definition would lose all meaning and all coherence. I'm of the very strong opinion that psychotherapy is an art. It's not a science in the same way that extracting rat brains and making slides of razor-thin slips of their neural tissue is a science. It's very different. I don't razor-thin my clients' lives. Part of the art of psychotherapy that we are losing in the name of science is the therapist himself, or more likely herself. As you all know, the vast majority of psychotherapists, talk therapists, are female. And so, if you're a man in this field, and if you live outside of Utah, then, or even outside of Utah County, you'll find that you are a pretty rare person. And I think that's one of the strengths of the field I don't think we talk about enough, is that all genders are welcome, and that this is a place where more feminine styles of leadership tend to work really, really well. So that's a subject I touch on more in the psychology of sex class. For now, though, the introspective way of appreciating one's being as a being in relation and getting in touch with who all of this being is in relation to others is bulldozed over by therapists who want technique. They want a recipe book. They want, okay, if my client is depressed, what is the magical recipe formula of techniques I give my client so they'll no longer be depressed? Science, please help me, science. Okay? that the therapist who contemplates, who feels, who struggles with their clients, who gets in the mud with their clients, that model of therapy is dying if not dead. Good therapists are rare. If you've had a good therapist who really understood you, really got you, that's brilliant. I'm very grateful. I bet you what they did with you in session, they weren't taught in graduate school. Because increasingly graduate programs are follow this empirically, scientifically validated formula, this scientific best practices is what they talk about, empirically validated best practices. Like at the clinics where I've worked, we get hit with that from insurance companies. What is your therapy empirically best practice? Meaning, is it scientific in the objectified rat brains on slides science? And so we'll play their dance, dance their dance, play their games, but they're not interested in the way in which my client and I were crying together over his relapse and all the pain and suffering that relapse brought to him. They weren't interested in the way he finally confronted his mother about her perfectionism and how that has destroyed the life of herself and her children, and how he kept reminding his mother that he loves her, and how he can't keep carrying her emotionally on his shoulders, the shame and judgment that she gives her children so freely. They don't care about that. They want science. They want rat brains on slides. We're going to do things differently. Good therapy is not science. Good therapy is art. Good therapy is being a whole person in relation to other people who are either whole or who are becoming whole. That's what good therapy is. And part of you being a whole person is you knowing who you are. Quit telling your stories about yourself, these bullshit stories to yourself. Be honest, be real. Look at what color your own butthole is and don't deny it. Get into your guts. Quit living a life of shame and perfectionism. Get into who you really are. Because I hate to break it to you, the person that feels, the person that's real, that person is a good therapist. Not the person who is so busy micromanaging their own opinion of themselves or other people's opinions of them. They're not good therapists. Be who you are. Learn to grow comfortable in your own skin. One of the first lessons I would like you all to learn about being a therapist is there are people out there who need you to be their therapist. You personally. They don't need me to be their therapist. Yes, there are people out there who need me to be their therapist too, but not necessarily the same people who need you to be their therapist. Your warts, the color of your butthole, your smile, your beautiful teeth, I don't care what it is, metaphorically speaking, literally speaking, it's your heart, your soul. Somebody out there needs you to be their therapist. When I teach and train supervisees, when I'm doing therapy with them, I have given up and gave up very long ago in my clinical training how to have them be different therapists, because I knew that wasn't the goal. Instead, it's become my job from early in my career to help them be the best kind of therapist that they are. And so I've taught and trained therapists who are very structured, very first-dimensional in their thinking, very categorical. Well, okay, if you're going to do that, that will probably help some clients some of the time. Let's do that. I've had very second-dimensional, those poor people are so stressed out of their mind and perfectionistic, and it's miserable for them to live. At the same time, though, it is very helpful for some clients some of the time. So if you're going to do that, let's talk about the assumptions you have, the implications that's going on here in terms of your life, and if you're unwilling to modify those assumptions through careful, heavy, rigorous practice of trying to be a different way, then let's help you be the best way you can be in a way that helps other people rather than hurts them or does nothing for them, right? Third dimensional thinkers. I've had a bunch of trainings where it's all just relative, man. It's all just relative. Health, unhealth, mental health, mentally healthy, all of that's all just relative. Okay, well, if you're going to do that, and if that's your attitude, then let's become aware of it. Where does that come from? What does it mean? How is that helping your clients? By what standard of help? By what standard of help that is shared by others? And then rarely and blissfully, occasionally I get a fourth dimensionally thinking trainee. And then we talk about how inhibiting that is. Because when you're seeing everything always in relation to everything else, you know that if you move in one direction with one client in one way, that there are always unintended consequences you cannot foresee. Many someones need you to be their therapist. Your heart, your soul, your demeanor, your attitude. All I can ask you to do as your professor is know who the hell that is. Who are you? What do you bring to the table in a therapy relationship? What do you assume? What do you believe? How do those work together? How do they not? How does that manifest in your relationships with yourself and in relationships with other people at the same time? Okay? You may not think you're a good therapist, but somebody out there needs you to be you. Who the hell is that? Not who the hell is the client. Who the hell are you? Because that's who they need. All I can ask you to do is figure it out. So, assumptions, in my experience, correlate far more tightly with they imply, assumptions, every assumption we have has an implication for how we live, act, feel, believe, relate. Okay? Assumptions have far stronger implications for how we are as a person, and therefore how we are as a therapist, than our beliefs do. And some of you say, "Man, what do you mean? What do you mean?" Okay, I'm regularly told how offensive I am by using religious examples. It's not my intention to offend, so I'm going to keep using those examples. One day, I was participating in a religious discussion for the Latter-day Saint Church in a group called Elders Quorum. This is the group of men who are about, 21 to near to dead, you know what I mean, or on their way there. And I was asked to teach the lesson, which I'm very, very rarely asked to do, because many religious people, regardless of religion, don't think that fourth dimensional thinking has anything to do with religion, and they don't like my point of view that to say Christ-like, Buddhist-like thinking is fourth dimensional thinking. So that's an aside. So there were 10 men in the room besides myself, and I gave them all an exercise. I said, what I would like you to do is write down what priesthood is and how it works. And I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and you can use all of the standard works. So the Bibles, Book of Mormons, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Prices, right? The Bible, it's called the Quad, right? It's a big old brick of pages. And so you can do that all you want, okay? 10 minutes, you can't confer with one another, do that. And so I counted off 10 minutes while I was doing the exercise myself. And so by the time we were done, we had 11, and they had to column, what it is and how it works with scriptural references, etc. I gave them a worksheet to fill out. And so we brought them all together, and we had 11 different models. So all of these men hold the priesthood, right? They all have certain privileges, obligations, powers, responsibilities, however you want to talk about it. Believe me, we talked about it in 11 different ways, all in the same room at the same time. And it was really neat, the second half of our discussion. The first was acknowledging that all of our stuff was as similar as it was different. So there were some strong similarities across some people and real differences with other people all at the same time. And in fact, even some people's own models had coherences and decoherences within their own model. And talking about the struggle of what that means, why it's that way, etc. And the other thing we talked about, the whole point of the lesson wasn't just to show, okay, there's all of this variation on this concept we all take for granted. The other part of it is, okay, now that we're all clear that we're not clear on this concept, and that there's all of these different points of view, overlapping points of view, sometimes very disparate points of view on this particular subject. What do we actually do? How do you live this thing called priesthood? How do you actually do it? And that's where the conversation got very uncomfortably real for many of the men in the room. Because they wrote me, on the worksheet, they gave me what they believe. The stories they tell themselves, and those stories were variable between those individuals. but it's how they actually live the principles that show their assumptions. And that's where it felt very intimately intrusive. One guy, I think he wanted to say something a little different, but he said, Matt, it's like you've stuck your finger in my armpit. I think he wanted to say butthole, but you've stuck your finger in my armpit. And I go, what do you mean? He says, well, this just feels like very intrusive, like very intimate. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know you that well. I'm like, dude, I've known you for 10 years. But that kind of personal vulnerability relates for a lot of people to shame. And I'm very sorry that it does. I don't think that it needs to. Like, not that I'm picking on religion, it's just very easy to use as a way to categorize and distinguish assumption and belief. It started with Kierkegaard, for example, for those of you that are familiar with your philosophical and Christian history. Zip codes that have the highest participation in Christian denominations, particularly conservative Christian denominations, also have the highest rates of pornography consumption. Sit on that for a minute. I once presented that at a conference as I was doing a lot of research at the time on so-called pornography addiction. And I don't think it's pornography addiction, I think it's pornography compulsion, and it's fueled by shame. And so I hold models of therapy around that, etc. I was presenting those at conferences, and the treatment outcomes, etc. Because some people love science, and so science is the only way they'll take it seriously. So rant over. So as I'm presenting this, somebody, I kid you not, said, well, within a given zip code, because it was a heavily LDS Latter-day Saint zip code, and they said, what if you didn't distinguish? And you said, what if it's all of the non-Latter-day Saints in that zip code that are just consuming like overwhelming tons of pornography? And I went, well, first of all, given how few Latter-day Saints there are in that zip code, they would need to be consuming porn 24/7, 365 to hit these numbers. And I said, second of all, you're flying in the face of all the research I presented earlier, where when we actually poll people anonymously, and you have to do it anonymously or they won't tell you, there is a very strong relationship that the more religious somebody is, the more pornography they use, if it's a Christian denomination. Why is that is a very interesting question, and the therapeutic things you can do about that is also an interesting question, but it's not my point today. When we sit down with these men and women, and I ask them about it, they believe pornography is bad, but they're using it a lot. Do you see the difference? That their assumptions are really uncomfortable for them to get in touch with. And there's a lot of shame for them as they try to get in touch with it. That there's a lot of assumptions around their sexuality, around their sexual arousal, where their belief pornography is bad, missionary-style sex with your lights off after praying with your celestial partner is good. Like they have these very black and white ways of thinking about sexuality, but their assumptions are different than their black and white thinking. And those assumptions about being a sexual being and having sexual feeling and having stress that you can numb out to porn to or masturbate away or things like that, there's this huge conflict between their assumptions and beliefs, but nobody wants to hear about their assumptions in terms of the broader culture, especially in their religious life. They just want to hear about the beliefs because their assumptions are sinful and bad, so they've learned to choke them down and not process them or own them. And so a lot of our therapy ends up being getting into what your assumptions are. Now, that's great when it comes to looking at what clients assume and how what they assume about being sexual beings is very different than what they believe, right? But what about you? What about me? What about us? What about our assumptions and beliefs? Some years ago, and I'm not going to name names because if you guys have done it, LGBT advocacy in this area, you know who I'm talking about. A colleague of mine who did a lot of work around gay rights, especially trans rights, and therapist, very gifted therapist, and has saved a lot of lives. She's very good at working with LGBT and trans young adults. No one was more shocked than her own daughter. So her own daughter, born XY bodied, named Charles, went by Charlie, and was identified as male by parents, by everybody else, and Charlie went along with it. Charlie's, of course, not this young woman's real name. Charlie felt increasing dysmorphia with the identified gender she had been given, and so at the age of 16 came out to her mother, and assuming, because of all the advocacy and therapy work, etc., all the public meetings and marches, etc., that Mom's been involved in, that Mom would be her number one supporter. Mom freaked out, melted down, started saying horrible things using quite powerfully expletive language, and then kicked Charlie out. Charlie then, literally with just a backpack in hand, tried to go and live with Dad. Dad wouldn't. Mom and Dad had been divorced and estranged for years. Dad wouldn't have her in, so Charlie ended up couch surfing until finally she found a friend's family that would take her in at the age of 16. And so a little while later, knowing Charlie and being involved in trying to get Charlie a place to live, Charlie unfortunately lived too far away from school to be able to come live with me, but she wanted to still go to her high school. I talked to my friend a couple weeks later and I said, please help me understand. And let's just say that's the last conversation she and I had. Because although she believes, and she will tell you the story and tell herself story, that LGBT and trans rights and all those other things, her assumption is that trans people are somehow broken. And their brokenness is due to misparenting. And therefore, when her daughter came out as trans, then my colleague melted down because that represented a profound failure on the part of my colleague. And that she now saw her daughter as a broken being and that the brokenness was Mom's fault, and she couldn't confront the shame of that. There's a big difference there between her assumptions and her beliefs, right? And that was already having a pretty big role in therapy. I didn't know it because I'd never sat in on therapy with her, but I learned later that her therapy was very parent-blaming therapy. That's how she would help trans folks. Not about reconciliation or family coming together or being together with family through this very difficult transition process, but instead helping the client see, whether true or not, that their misparenting was the reason why they were experiencing trans dynamics to begin with. But when I would ask her what we call trans things, ask her about her beliefs are very different. She had very sophisticated models all up on the latest research about trans dynamics. But those weren't her assumptions. Her assumptions were about brokenness and about misparenting. So I will use myself as an example. Right now, well, on Wednesday, I am going to be visiting with a client again. We've had some sessions. And I am increasingly monogamist in my belief. Like when I was younger, even though I was a monogamist by habit, it was, hey, I happen to be a monogamist. Other people can be polyamorous or polygamist or whatever else, and I don't care. They get to do that. And I was more third-dimensional thinking back then. But as I have grown older and older and older, I'm becoming more and more in favor of monogamy. Personally, politically, etc. Because of all the 3 a.m. calls, rushing to the hospital, yet another suicide attempt because yet another friends with benefits relationship fell apart, or another polyamorous group went ballistic, and so it's far less drama in loving, committed monogamy, and on average. And so I've got a client who is enthusiastically polyamorous, not promiscuous, right? She and her 4 lovers all have a mutual understanding. They're all lovers together. And that's not her presenting problem, right? That's not an issue. Yeah, there's some communication things she wants to talk about and work on, but that's not the issue. Her issue is other things. But because I have these monogamist assumptions, right, that I'm increasingly in touch with, I need to be also in touch with the way those are informing my conversations with her, right? That because I have this particular moral position vis-a-vis monogamy, therefore, I may be more or less likely to respond, to reflect, etc., on certain key terms in certain key ways at certain key times. And so, on the one hand, I'm unabashed and my therapy style is very open. I don't lecture at my clients or tell them that my way is superior, because I don't necessarily think it is. At the same time, though, I get to be aware of where my assumptions inform my half of the conversation. Because my beliefs are, she is a grown-up woman, she gets to do her own thing. My deeply set assumptions are, sometimes doing our own thing isn't necessarily good for us or other people, and my assumptions are a little more cautious around that. So how is that cautiousness informing my therapeutic relationship with this particular client? What I say, what I don't say, etc. Not in an inhibitory way where I've got to be all things to all people, instead to be aware. And so I'm thinking of a client in prison, for example. I saw this guy as a poor, pitiful pearl, woe is me, nobody loves me, everybody hates me, I'm going to go eat worms, nothing's ever my fault, everything's always other people's fault. And my assumption is manhood means procreate, protect, work, nurture, right? Those were my assumptions on manhood. So I'm meeting this guy that he's a player, he's big and strong, gets in fights regularly, but nothing's ever his fault. You know, he came across to me as super lazy, and I had very judgy assumptions about him, and that very much informed our therapeutic relationship, whereas I saw him as pretty pathetic, okay? By getting in touch with my assumptions about how he was violating my standards of manhood, he wasn't protecting, he wasn't providing, he wasn't, working hard. Instead, it was him. He worked hard to get big muscles to get the girls, and that was it. And it was all about promiscuity and play and violence, and that was his definition of manhood. Because I was judgy with him, I was less engaged emotionally and authentically in the therapeutic relationship. And so I can remember about 2 months in, I walked in and sat down and apologized. I said, my assumptions is that you're a player. You do things only for you and only in your way, and therefore I've been out of touch with the complexity of being that you are. And of course he's lost on this. He just thought I was a little inhibited and a little shy in therapy, or a little bit quiet. And so by really getting in touch with what my assumptions were, then I could have a more authentic conversation. That doesn't mean I agree with his lifestyle and that even I should, or it's necessary that I do. Instead, it's up to me to authentically relate to him given the lifestyle that he has, right? And to be able to more clearly and openly with myself. So when he's laying in his cell all day feeling sorry for himself, what are all the reasons why I have a problem with that? Well, part of that are my assumptions that he's not manning up. Part of those, though, are also my assumptions that life is also really hard. So there's this conflict in my assumptions, and now how do I put that into practice with this particular client, okay? So my theoretical orientation tends to involve openness and transparency, and so that was a part of the conversation. He didn't appreciate it. It didn't matter to him one way or the other, but other clients do, and other clients have at other times. And so what mattered to me and what mattered to that therapeutic relationship, professionally speaking, was that I was in better touch with what I was doing and why, and to take more responsibility and accountability for it, okay? If you don't know who you are, it's hard to take responsibility for yourself. So in this class, we're going to talk about assumptions regarding agency, causality, epistemology, and 3 different dimensions of morality. So you may be curious why we're hitting morality so hard, and that's because 85% of presenting problems in therapy are moral problems that the clients understand and think of morally and in moral ways. And so therefore, if we're not able to talk about our own assumptions and beliefs morally speaking, we're not able to meet our clients where they're at, because science is an amoral event. Well, at least that's what it purports to be. We'll deconstruct that later and show that science actually has a particular set of moral assumptions that are problematic and unscientific. So for now, though, what we assume about whether people have free will or not has big implications for how we treat them. What we assume about what causes human behavior has a big implication on how we treat other people. What we assume about how people learn really informs how we do therapy, because a lot of therapy, advertently or inadvertently, is teaching. And then what we assume across these 3 different moral dimensions very much informs what clients get out of therapy, what we get out of therapy, what are seen as good problems to have, bad problems to have, good solutions, bad solutions, etc. All of that is deeply laden in moral assumption. So I'm thinking about various colleagues of mine and what they assume about therapy. A colleague of mine, for example, comes in and she starts outlining the early parental relationships with primary attachment figures starting at as young an age as her clients can remember. Okay? And so it's really fun and meaningful for me when my colleague comes in and does this, because she gets these incredibly detailed histories of the client's experience of their primary caregiving figures starting from a very young age. But the timelines usually end around age 8, sometimes as late as age 10, and then nothing. And so she could be working with a client who's 42, but the timeline ends at age 8, right? Huh. And so I asked her about that, and she looked at me puzzled. And she said, well, we're talking about attachment, right? And I said, well, yes, you are talking about attachment, and I am here following along with this conversation, and I'm very curious about this. And she goes, well, attachment forecloses at a certain age, right? Their attachment styles don't change after a certain age. And I went, oh, they don't? She says, no, according to this and this research, they don't. I said, okay. And so I said, help me understand what happened when this client was 7 and how that relates to his dynamics when he's 42. And so she would show me her model of how it is that these attachment problems when he was a small child and an infant, how that related to his mental health problems as a 42-year-old. And so I asked, I said, so is what's going on in his life right now, with work, with his wife, with his son being very sick, does any of that have to do with his current issues and behavior? And she looked at me puzzled, and she goes, well, of course. And I say, where is that on your timeline? And then she got really flustered and confused. Here's why. Her assumptions are that it is our past behavior, our past experiences, especially our experiences in early childhood, that cause our behavior in adulthood. So therefore that implies that when she does therapy, it's all early childhood stuff, that she just processes the hell out of it. There's interventions around those dynamics, reparents the client where she's the nurturing, positive attachment figure, etc. And so although she believes that clients are whole beings and they're holistic people and you need to look at the whole context, that was she believes. But she assumes it's all early childhood stuff, that the past, especially the early past, causes the present in a temporal way, right, through space and time. So therefore her assumptions when it comes to cause is in contradiction with her beliefs, but you notice it's her assumptions for therapy that guide her therapy far more so than her beliefs do, okay, and that's extremely common. So I another example of working with some colleagues. So I was doing a training around sexual compulsive dynamics. Other people call them sex addictions. When you sit down and compare somebody looking at spankmonkey.com an hour a day and masturbating versus a heroin addiction, there are some vague similarities and a whole ton of differences. So sexual compulsions can be a problem, and so let's talk about treating them as compulsions rather than as addictions, because although the therapies are similar, they're also pretty different. So I was doing a training with other therapists around sexual compulsions, and it was really fun, because what I did is I pulled them to begin with about their beliefs about clients' sexualities, like client sexual behavior. And all of them expressed a very strong third-dimensional relativism. Clients get to choose their own sexual behavior, and they get to do them, and it's all relative. And if clients enjoy dressing up as dogs and during sex with other furries, that's great. They get to do them. No judgment. Has nothing to do with my therapy. Okay. And so there were also some questions I gave them about pornography use. Oh yeah, people, pornography use can be very healthy, and it's great. And so when I started asking them and talking to them about pornography use. And what was really interesting is they were all super concerned and were acting like pornography was really bad. That wasn't my presentation. right? And so one of the things that I highlighted to them, and I gave them another questionnaire, is if a client comes in and they have these presenting problems, is it a problem? And they all said yes. Whereas in the previous one, they said, no, it's all relative. I don't push my values on my clients, I don't. But then in the second questionnaire, they demonstrated that they freely do. Of course they push their values onto their clients. Of course if a young man who was caught masturbating by his mother before his LDS mission gets sent to the bishop's office and then forced into counseling for his pornography problem, is the counselor going to sit and say, what, you only masturbate, look at porn 1 hour a week? Dude, you are so far away from the national average. You are like super chaste. You are like angel baby, sexually speaking. Like, why the hell are we talking? No, they don't. They just take it up as a problem and start doing therapy there. They don't just stop and go, rant off. Point is, our assumptions and our beliefs are often in contradiction, okay? And they're often in contradiction, especially around moral matters. So the way I believe myself to be as a person doesn't necessarily reflect in my actual behavior with other people. And there's been a lot of research on the stories people tell themselves about being a morally good person and then actually measuring the behaviors that they engage in. And there's just not a good correlation, guys. There's not for me, there's not for you. Well, I don't believe myself to be a good person, but believe me, in the research I've done on people who believe themselves to be good people, I think they are in general, but it's not black and white. There's a lot of things they do. In fact, for some of the people we've researched, I wouldn't let them babysit my kids. I'd be nervous about them being in my house, right? That there's a lot of people who believe themselves to be good, but their behavior doesn't line up. It's because our behavior is more strongly associated with our assumptions than with our beliefs, okay? And so assumptions imply behavior. Assumptions imply intervention, styles of therapy, etc. That's where assumptions come from. So, just to hammer the point home even more, Yale Seminary, they have a famous Christian seminary teaching people how to be pastors and bishops, etc. Some social scientists, some social psychologists came in and said, okay, so these are people who are at a Master's of Divinity class. They're getting their MDiv, meaning they're going to be pastors someday relatively soon. And so these social psychologists came in and said, okay, the speaker for the incoming class in this particular seminary just canceled. We need somebody to give a talk on the Good Samaritan, right? Well, behind the scenes, these same social psychologists had set up a confederate who, when the student who volunteered to go give a lecture on the Good Samaritan was walking by a certain building, a confederate would trip and spill a huge armload of books and papers all in front of the subject, all in front of the student who volunteered to go give a presentation to the other students. And then they would count how many of these seminarians actually stopped to help. Really, that's what Good Samaritans do, right? They stop to help. And they were surprised to find that not very many did. Many of the people on their way to give a lecture on the Good Samaritan, which they believed is a true and correct principle, didn't stop to help when they had a turn to be a Good Samaritan. And so they've replicated this study later, and this time they added an element of time. Time unit 1 was, it's 10 minutes across campus. They've given you 5 minutes to basically sprint across campus to give this lecture on the Good Samaritan. Very few of those people, like 1 in 10, stopped to help, right? Then there was another where they had 20 minutes, meaning if they walked at a good pace, they could still get to where they were going and still have 10 minutes to spare. And about half, 5 in 10, stopped. And then another where they gave them there was 45 minutes later, and 6 out of 10 stopped, 60% stopped. But that begs a question. In the two time frames where they had plenty of time to stop and help, did these people not believe in the principle of the Good Samaritan? And so they did qualitative follow-ups with all of these subjects. And of course, the subjects who were in a huge hurry saw it as a more Samaritan thing to do to volunteer to give the Good Samaritan talk and to sprint across campus to give that talk. Therefore, they didn't have time. They were thinking of the greatest good. But for those who had plenty of time, there was this neat tension between their belief in being a Good Samaritan and their assumptions of the value of their own time, the value of their own selves, the awkwardness they might feel as they attempt to be a good Samaritan, and therefore they were more self-focused, that their assumption was self-focused, but their belief is good Samaritan, other-focused, okay? The more you dial into the contradiction between assumptions and beliefs, the better you'll be able to do it for yourself, and I would argue the better able you're to do it for your clients. How many times have you gotten in trouble in your life because of your habits? How many times have you gotten in trouble in life where you feel like your head and heart are pulling you in different directions? Okay, all of these are a conflict between assumptions and beliefs, and they're replete. You get really good at hearing when people are contradicting themselves between what they say and what they do, or even as they're talking to you, the underlying emotion is very different than the words being expressed. And so as you tune into that more and more, it really gives you more tools as a therapist to be able to help them unpack what's going on with them. So, how are we doing on time? Okay, I have just a few minutes. So, this is a writing from Sigmund Freud. Personality evolves out of the interaction between biological factors and the vicissitudes of experience. That interaction is influenced not only by the nature of life events, but also the ways in which those experiences are absorbed and handled. Likewise, overall mood and attitudes toward life are affected by early experiences. Quote, basic mood, unquote, begins to develop during the first year of life, and, quote, confident expectancy, unquote, is a mood state that can emerge after a happy first year in which the baby's needs are met. Okay, there's a lot of assumptions going on here. Holy cow! So let's break it down, shall we? Personality evolves out of interaction between biological factors and the vicissitudes of experience. Meaning, so we're born with certain bodies, certain neurochemicals, certain guts, certain hormones, etc. And we're born that way. And then the vicissitudes means the ups and downs of the goods, the pleasures, the pains of living. So personality is our organic self, meaning who we are genetically, biologically, and how that is shaped by our experiences. Some of you are going, well, of course, Matt, that's what it is. No, there's all sorts of other things that can go into personality that aren't being assumed here. For example, you just saw a brief glimpse of it. I used to be a very hot-tempered person. I used to be very scary and intimidating, whereas now I'm the big fluffy teddy bear and everybody likes to hang out and be hugged by Draper. There was years of my life, people didn't want to be within 10 feet of me because I was so intense and so angry all the time. And so I endeavored to not be that person anymore. And it was a choice, and it was hard. And I learned to grow soft where I was hard, and grow lukewarm where I used to be blistering hot, to grow comfortingly warm where I used to be a laser that would cut, okay? And so all of that was a deliberate, focused attempt. None of that is in that model. Your personality, according to this, is a product of nature and nurture. Your choice and your current context have nothing to do with it. Okay? So the interaction is influenced not only by the nature of life events, but also by the ways those experiences are absorbed. So therefore, certain life events can happen, but there's some we're aware of that affect our behaviors, and others that aren't aware of and may affect our behavior less. But regardless, where is the intentionality? Like, where is the human will? Where is the I'm going to survive this? This is hard and I'm going to do it. You know, the post-traumatic growth kind of model where the vicissitudes of life may suck, but as traumatizing as your life may be, it has also helped forge you into the mighty person that you are because of the way you took it up. And there's an intimation of that, this, and handled, right? Absorbed and handled. But then what causes our ability to handle it? Well, then he gets into it in the next sentence. Overall mood and attitudes towards life are affected by early experiences. So even our ability to handle things is caused by nurture, caused by previous experience. There is no choice. There is no me choosing in the face of all of my trauma, all of my life difficulty to do something different. All of that is gone. It's just the way I was programmed as this moist robot by the experiences, which is the data that creates the being that I am. There is no me, there is no will, there is no choice, there is no context, it's just nature and nurture. So the better you get at reading these and looking at all the things that they're assuming behind the scenes, Freud doesn't come out and say, yeah, I totally believe that everything that causes your behavior is just nature and nurture. He doesn't come out and say that. Instead, you read between the lines, and after a while, guys, it'll be increasingly obvious to you. Likewise, Carl Rogers, okay, very different than Freud in some ways. I'm going to argue later in the semester, shockingly similar at the same time. The internal frame of reference. This is the perceptual field of the individual. It is the way the world appears to us from our own unique vantage point. Given the whole continuum of learning and experiences we've accumulated, along with the meanings attached to the experience and feelings. From the client-centered point of view, this internal frame of reference provides the fullest understanding of why people behave the way they do. It is to be distinguished from external judgments of behavior, attitudes, and personality. Look, Rogers and Freud, okay, these guys are my bros. So I don't mean to say like their theories are bad and they should feel bad. No, their theories are brilliant. What we're doing is we're looking at their assumptions, okay? That one of the things that Rogers has just done is he put the whole being of the self inside the person, and it is their internal frame of reference that matters. And that's the internal frame of reference that somehow you, who is external, the therapist, needs to be able to get in touch with that internal frame of reference, because that is where the true understanding of why people behave the way they do. Now, I'm sympathetic to that because I think our assumptions have a lot to do with how we behave. I'm wondering if the world and the people in the world also have something to do with how we behave. What Rogers just did is he demonstrated to us, and he doesn't come right out and say it, but he demonstrates to us how it is that we are actually internally located. Later in the few units coming up, we'll talk about individualism. Okay? And so individualism is the ontological moral perspective that you are located inside your flesh, and that's where the truth of you is from within your internal frame of reference. This is a very interesting assumption, that the truth of you isn't in relation, that's not where your being comes into focus. It's not in how you act and behave. No, that's not what he assumes. What he assumes is it's all this internal perceptual point of view that is actually separate from and distinguished from all of these other things. What a fascinating model. But he didn't come right out and say, I assume that ontologically we are individuals, isolate monads, radically separate from other beings, and the truth of us is inside this monadic state. He doesn't come out and say that, right? He assumes that. This is what he believes, right? And so you read the belief, and you can begin to pick apart what the assumptions are. And that's the point of these exercises. So in our next unit, we are going to start getting into the assumptions of agency and how to tell as a therapist what our own assumptions of agency are and what our clients' assumptions of agency are. So we will do that in our next unit.